hopefully. Now we are recording. And the recording and our notes document will be publicly available on our website following this presentation. Please feel free to jump into our shared notes doc. That link is being shared in the chat. And if you have any questions as the presentation goes on, please flag that either in Zoom chat or in the shared notes document. And we will go through those after the presentation, and in some cases may be able to respond on the fly, particularly for those that are good at monitoring multiple parts of their screen, which I may not be. Next slide. Ground rules and expectations. So we are Invest in Open Infrastructure, and we provide forums for learning and conversation. And we hope that you all will be curious. We hope you'll all hold space for each other. We will try to hold space for you as well. And please be respectful. We want to build community here, not do anything that tears it down. We do have a code of conduct. Please feel free to take a look at that. And thank you, Melissa, for letting us know that you're having access problems. So we will make sure that the link to the document is open. In every case, the code of conduct is definitely open. That's on our open website. Please check that. And if you need it for any reason, please use that. Next slide. Here I am going to hand off to one of our other presenters, Caitlin Thaney, who is our executive director. I should mention I'm the director of programs for Invest in Open, and Jennifer Kemp, who has been a fantastic consultant for several years now with Invest in Open, is also going to be part of the presentation. The agenda that we have for you all today is that we're going to tell you very quickly about IOI. I'm going to hand off to Caitlin for that. We'll tell you a bit about the framing of this particular project, what we were trying to do, what we were asked to do, some of our findings from the research. This is the first time that we're getting a chance to present them, so we really do look forward to your feedback. We'll share some of the recommendations that we've come to, and then we'll move to question and answer and next steps. So Caitlin, with that, take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see all the names here, whether I can see your face or not. A little about IOI. So Invest in Open Infrastructure was started to really focus on exploring different ways to help increase the adoption, the success, the implementation, and also the investment in the open infrastructure that powers research. That work is really core in our mind to ensuring that anyone who wants the ability to participate and access research has that opportunity. And we really think that for open knowledge and open systems and all the other open movements, open access, open data, for that to flourish, our systems need to be similarly designed. And so we work to help advance a vision where open infrastructure is the foundation and the default for research and scholarship. We do this in a few different ways. The work that this project falls under is something from our data room, which is where we do our research, and we work to provide not only tools, but also analysis, things like the State of Open Infrastructure report, other things such as InfraFinder, which you'll hear a little bit more about, and also deep research into some of the areas. As an organization, IOI is dedicated also to helping to monitor the not only developments in the space, helping to advocate for open infrastructure and the evolution of that, where funding is flowing, where it's not, and other things that help impact that. We also provide strategic support, which is more targeted application of that research to help accelerate that pace of implementation and change, working with infrastructures, working with funders, working with institutions and research networks to help put that work into practice, and also to help provide some of that critical capacity that we know many infrastructures and other organizations often need to help jumpstart some of these projects to start moving towards this more open future. And then lastly, we work to help increase the amount of folks that are contributing to the funding of this infrastructure, and we view that as a really critical aspect of our work. And we also administer different funding pilots of various scales based on our research, trying to be as evidence-based as possible and exploring means that we can not only diversify the sources of funding, helping to broaden again that aperture of who's contributing to supporting these really critical projects in our eyes, but also the mechanisms for allocating that funding to ensure that areas that may not necessarily be getting the right resourcing, we can maybe draw some more attention to and experiment in how we get that through. And so those are some of the main ways and instruments of how we approach our work. And I'm really excited to throw it back to the team to tell you a little bit more about our preliminary findings from this landscape analysis around community infrastructure for research software.
So I will take back over for a couple of slides and give you just a quick backdrop on what this project is and where it's come from. So next slide, Caitlin. And again, a huge thanks to the Sloan Foundation for their generous support of this project and for their generous support of this space overall. So research software, as we see it, and hopefully as you all do too, it's pretty common definitions at this point. We see it as a functional cornerstone for research disciplines, both in and beyond academic contexts. So looking across life sciences and physics, of course, but also social sciences and humanities. Research software is integral to the use, the modeling, and analysis of data in disciplines across the research enterprise. It also undergirds critical research functions and goals, including openness and reproducibility and equity. But even with all of that being true, research software historically has not been considered a research output in its own right. So as many of you know on this call, longstanding gaps in recognition and support for research software have been narrowing recently, and that's in large part due to the active work of stakeholders in this field. And that, again, is many of you here today, in fact. Over the last 2 decades, roughly, research software developers, users, and stakeholders have founded a whole bunch of organizations, initiatives, and communities of practice. They've done this both within specific disciplinary contexts and also within national contexts. And so what we see is this burgeoning field, and I'll define that in just a minute, but this burgeoning field that's emerging. And it makes this a really important moment to step back and evaluate how the maturation process is going and to try to identify some ways to help the field to formalize. So our remit has been to identify some of those ways that research software's varied stakeholders are able to help level up the field from its kind of emergent state that I will claim that we are still in right now, or that the field is still in right now, with many independent efforts underway that are competing for the same resources into an ecosystem where there are more resilient and interdependent and ongoing support structures for research software. So the work that we're sharing with you today has been primarily concerned with research software infrastructure. And I want to mark that. So it's not just research software we're studying here. We're really trying to study research software infrastructure. And by that, we mean the functions, the tools, the structures, and the human labor that research software relies upon. And we definitely acknowledge that open source code and even research software itself is sometimes itself considered infrastructure. But in those cases, the code as infrastructure is really supporting something else like research. So we are defining our term as defining our scope as intentionally focusing on those infrastructure elements that support the development, use, publishing, review, curation, discovery, and maintenance of research software. For more about infrastructure, please see Katina, where there's a really great new article that Caitlin wrote I think it was posted about a week ago. Next slide. So as for what we have actually been up to, our team started in October 24 on this project with a mix of desk research and the identification of some potential interviewees. We approached a bunch of representatives from 23 organizations that are working in this field, and we spoke with 19 over the subsequent months. So their perspectives have been key for this study. We acknowledge, of course, again, that the study is necessarily and intentionally limited. Next slide. So what is guiding us? We've got a very specific lens here. We're looking for places where connections can be forged, where gaps might be able to be mended, and where overcrowding and duplication of efforts could be addressed. Again, streamlining things so that there's more coherence and cohesion in a true ecosystem rather than a lot of independent activities working sometimes at cross purposes. So we use a spectrum approach to measure where research software seems to be right now as a field, or research software infrastructure seems to be, against some common maturity markers in our work. And we also call out a few linchpins and standouts, and we share some of the items that repeatedly arose, especially in these interviews, as high interest outcomes and benefits that many in this community seem to be seeking right now. Next slide, please. So massive thank you to those on this call who participated. An indicator of the commitment and development stage of the landscape is how many different hats many participants wear. And so in our conversations with, again, 19 people total, we remarked many times on the multiple roles and multiple hats that people wear in this space right now. I do want to call attention on this slide. We are mostly looking at the US and Europe, also some Africa, Latin America, some Australia for sure, UK. So this is it is a select group that is not meant to be representative of a global reality. It is trying to make sense of some of the global challenges, as well as disciplinary challenges, as well as general challenges and opportunities that are here for the field. Next slide. Got a bunch of links that we can share with you in the chat. One of those is not the report. So we are in the process right now of finalizing the report. It will go out for review before we publish it in February. So stay tuned. It is coming very, very soon. And of course, there will also be a link to this webinar eventually offered. Next slide. All right, so I promised that I would come back to this field thing. So I'm a sociologist by training. This work has definitely looked through a sociological lens to at least try to understand what's happening here in terms of field formation. So I define a field the way that many in field formation studies do. It's an economic, a cultural, or a political arena where there is knowledge, there's services, there's status, and there's goods. And these things are being produced and distributed and used. That's a very general term. It applies to all kinds of things. In my PhD studies, I was looking at the music industry and all kinds of ways that institutionalization of fields has happened there. Here we're looking at research software. I do want to note that there are other ways that you could look at this. You could look at the broader field that research software is a part of, with research more generally as well. But my assertion today is that this is a field that is in development right now as research software, that it's been emerging for the last 20 years or so, and that it's in a maturation mode right now. And our team has been working to study how different players and stakeholders and actors are experiencing that maturation process, and what might be most needed to help the field ultimately grow and flourish and serve research software practitioners of various types. Next slide. And there, I believe I get to hand it off to you, Jennifer.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to start off where we started all of our interviews, which with definitions, and just to acknowledge that there are many definitions that are generally pretty close, but there is some disagreement and some variation among the definitions. So we are sharing one common example here, and that is from the FAIR for Research Software. What's important to us for this project is how the community or different communities define research software, but we do also want to share how IOI defines infrastructure, because that is a question that came up in most of our interviews. So IOI defines open infrastructure as the shared research infrastructures needed to support open science, which is why you see also the UNESCO recommendation on open science there. And that serves the needs of its full spectrum of stakeholders. And that piece of things is important, and we will come back to that in participation and inclusion, and really getting broader representation of the full spectrum of stakeholders in research software and the work that they do. Like Catherine said, there are layers and variations of definitions. So if we go to the next slide. sort of a nice shorthand for the definition for research software infrastructure, and that makes it possible. And I do want to note that in most of our interviews, participants had their own definitions, their own sort of shorthand of how they define these terms, in addition to, or in some cases instead of, the formal definitions. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to turn things over to Emmy to look at a diagram of the landscape now.
Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Caitlin. And Jennifer. Yeah, so we started the project with some desk research, and again, this is a little bit of a map that we were trying to work on as we were looking at the literature out there and the different initiatives and organizations, and trying to sort of categorize and to help us understand better what research software infrastructure is and examples of those. I know that the text here is super small. It just goes, I think the general impression that I want to give here is one where we do have a lot of systems, technologies, and tools and people that are supporting the development and maintenance of research software. And there are also lots of other mappings that have existed and have helped understand and support our research there. And it goes on to show that this space is really emerging and is really diverse, and with lots and lots of stakeholders that are really important to the development of the space. And we definitely haven't sort of interviewed everyone. So this is also, this map is one that we are hoping to refine as we share out our report, and we'll love your feedback and contributions to it, as well as we start to build sort of our understanding of what research software infrastructure and the landscape of that is. So yeah, so we have, the short message is that we have tried to, we're trying here to understand, the various initiatives and categories of infrastructure. And we will be, well, Jennifer will be taking the next part forward to give you a high-level overview of the findings and recommendations that we have from there.
Thank you, Emmy. That's great. So this is what I meant by the full spectrum of stakeholders that we're going to keep coming back to. So thank you, Emmy. We can go to the next slide, and actually the one after that. Okay, so I'm going to take us through a few slides for our findings, which we grouped into a few high-level categories, and then put the landscape on a spectrum for each. So overall, sort of in between, and we'll come back to that as well. But let's go to the next slide for that first category. So again, there's a lot to all of this. We have a few bullets on each of these slides. There's not enough time or space on the slides to get into all of the findings. So these are just a few examples. If you have others, you have questions, again, put them in the chat or put them in the document, and we'll cover as much as we can. But this first category, this is something that we heard a lot in the interviews, this idea of things being hidden versus visible. So like an iceberg, where you see the tip above the water, but most of it is below the water. And another way of putting it, a different variation on that, is that there's a lot out there that is implicit, but not necessarily explicit. So, sort of de facto for a lot of aspects of the landscape. So a couple of examples here. And again, this applies pretty broadly. It doesn't apply just to organizations or just to research software work itself, but really kind of throughout the whole landscape. So a couple of examples of that, where there are a lot of resources, a lot of really good resources, but not necessarily canonical. And there's a lot of just missing information, and we'll touch on this in a couple of different slides as well. So the sort of product type data that you might want to see for, which software is getting used, how much is it getting used, what are the users, and things like that. Recognition and reward came up in almost all of our interviews, that there's certainly a lot of that work happening. Again, is it explicit? Is it sort of hidden? Is it canonical? So you can see where we've placed this on the landscape, on the spectrum. The landscape is sort of in the middle here, because we're kind of taking the average and putting that on a spectrum, but some pieces of it may fall to either side. And what's sort of important to the point that Catherine was making is that there's not really an authoritative center to the landscape, at least yet. And again, we'll come back to that, but let's go to the next slide. So this spectrum is on fragmented to coherent. You can see where we've got it on the landscape. Again, there's sort of a spread. It does apply broadly. Some areas may be closer to one end or another, but there's a lot of broad agreement. I know that the folks on this call know that. Everybody thinks research software should be a first-class research object. I don't think anybody's disputing that. There was a lot of discussion of recognition and support that's needed for functions across the software lifecycle. So, for example, maintenance is kind of notoriously difficult to get funding for, right? Just as one example. There's a lot of interest in collaboration and an increasing collaboration, but there are some very practical obstacles to that. So again, to the point about funding, funding across borders is a real practical obstacle to some, more formal kinds of collaboration. And then one of the things where there was an area of disagreement is the characterization of some of the work as siloed. This is something that we asked about in our interviews, or niche. And those are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? There are some cases where niche work makes a lot of sense, and it's a matter of interpretation of when that kind of tips over maybe into siloed. But, so overall, there is a lot of agreement. There's a lot of collaboration. Doesn't necessarily translate into sort of coherent or collective action in some cases. And, again, there are some very real practical obstacles to that. Next slide, please. So this is our last category of spectra, fragile to robust. And this is where things get a little bit tricky. This is a real danger zone potentially, because there is this moment of emergence. And so it has enormous potential and some peril to navigate. Some of that is outside the landscape. The defunding of science, the sort of fragility of academia, certainly in the US, we're seeing a lot of that now. We're going to come back to volunteers in the next slide. They're just, there are different academic cultures, so it's not always easy to, align on practices. And there again, there's information missing. So just having some more cost transparency, that's useful information for funders to have. And it's useful to kind of know, financially where things are in terms of fragility and stability. There's a lot of potential for shared services. This is, again, something that we talked about a lot in our interviews. Shared services, shared programs, really kind of working together a little bit more formally. And so for IOI, in the context of this project, that raises the question of, whether, to what extent and how infrastructures can or should support multiple disciplines. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to touch on this issue of volunteerism for just a minute, because again, this is something that came up a lot, and the field really relies heavily on it, right? There's this long established tradition and practice of volunteerism. An enormous amount of work is done through this in open source work, in publishing, in this tradition of service in academia. And one of the things that we heard a lot in our interviews was about the human infrastructure and really wanting to care for people who do this work in the system. And so when you rely heavily on volunteers, there's a risk of burnout. On the other hand, if you have paid staff, there's administration and management and overhead involved in that. So what is an equitable balance? That's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this a little bit, is because of equity issues. And this is, again, something that we observed and heard a lot about in our research. So it is really a luxury in many ways to be able to volunteer, right? This requires employment and employers who support the time to contribute to open source projects. And this is, typically in academia, which again is a little bit fragile these days. There's not as much tenure as there used to be, for example, and in commercial organizations. So we can talk about this or anything else in the discussion. But this is a nice example of a lot of the factors that we've seen coming up in our work. So I'm going to turn things over to Catherine now. I know everybody wants to hear about the recommendations.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right, so I'll note that we're echoing in some ways recommendations that others have made in the field. That's a good thing, we hope. We also have some recommendations that really do draw on the system level view that we're trying to take, and especially that draw across stakeholders. So next slide. The main thing that I'll start with in our recommendations is just that we we struggled to get them into categories that would make meaning for everyone who is reading this in the future. We grouped them into 4 categories in the end. The first one is really surface hidden information. So pertinent information about your costs, your participation in different things, your usage. As long as that information is hidden, there are a lot of things that we can't fix or see or capitalize on within the field. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. Strengthen the scaffolding. So as I mentioned, there are lots of individual endeavors right now. Some of those need to strengthen and specialize and become more focused on very specific and concrete deliverables that they can predictably give to the field. Acts that they can perform instead of the diffusion that I think we're still seeing a lot of that's very normal for this phase of development in fields. Grow the market. I'll have a lot to say about that. Markets do not spring from the earth, and we don't just suddenly discover them and build fields around them. Fields encourage the growth of markets. And I think we are stuck right now in a space where there is almost a market, but the functional pieces of it are still missing. I'm not using market to indicate a capitalist sense. It's certainly not where I encourage us to go. The market is just that exchange of materials, how those materials are exchanged. And that can happen with or without price tags attached to it and with different types of price tags attached to it. And then finally, invest in coordination. So we've got a lot of recommendations around how bridges might be built to help the groups that are doing such great work right now in research software and who are building those scaffolding pieces that become the infrastructure to work together towards shared aims, and to have funding that allows them to work together towards shared aims. Because much like volunteerism, collaboration is a luxury. You can't do it unless you've got somebody funding that activity. So that's kind of broad brushstrokes. We'll go a little bit more into detail, starting with, Caitlin, you can go to the next slide, with what I mean by scaffolding. Scaffolding is not quite infrastructure the way that I'm using it. It's all of those elements that with appropriate instantiation might become the pieces of backbone infrastructure. So again, I think at this stage of field development, research software has some pieces of infrastructure that are coming together: social infrastructure, technical infrastructure, administrative infrastructure. But those pieces still need to firm and get into more predictable patterns to be able to serve a growing, burgeoning field. Next slide. So what are our recommendations for the maturation process? And again, I want to say, this is always complicated, just like with the findings that Jennifer just went through. There's a spectrum, and we don't think that this is operating on a binary where, emergence is somehow way, way early and bad and maturation is good. That's not where we are. Similarly, a lot of those things on the spectrum that Jennifer just spoke to, it's not best to suddenly be at the far right-hand side of the spectrum, the way that we think about it in Western cultures, especially. The thing is, you want to know where you are on the spectrum. It's not that there is a valued place that you are aiming to get to on the spectrum and you win. It's that where you are tells you something about what you can do in order to improve health or improve efficiencies or other goals that you may have. I'm not always an efficiency advocate. So I want to mark very clearly, and we do in the report, we are at a critical moment in time. I think those who are in the US context feel it very much this week. But people all over the world are feeling it. Open science is being defunded. A lot of the structures that we rely on, especially those that are outside of industry, are being devalued, they are being defunded, and we have a rough road ahead. And I think that I could cite lots of things. I think most of us expect the next few years to be rocky in lots of parts of the world. And this includes the Netherlands, Argentina, and France. Like I could name lots of different examples of where this is happening. It's not locationally specific, and it's certainly not just tied to the US. It's just especially pertinent this week. Because of that, I think this field needs to mature faster. So there is a value judgment that we are bringing to the report, that this is a moment where we need to move faster and formalize faster so that we don't lose the traction that we've already gained or have this field stall and falter because of lack of resources, lack of time, lack of volunteer energy, et cetera. We need this to be more instantiated, and we need that a little bit faster than maybe we would at a different moment in time. So the recommendations that we have, again, the 4 buckets are: surface the hidden information that's out there, strengthen the scaffolding, grow the market, and invest in coordination. I'll go just a little bit in depth on each one of these. Um, in terms of surfacing information, one of the things, and others have noted this too, this is certainly not a unique observation from our report, there is so much information that's missing. And one of the real kind of challenges ahead, not just for research software, but for other spots too, is to surface that hidden information. And to do that, we have to agree on some standards. So understanding how fragmentation of practices if affects our ability to see what the practices are and how they're influencing growth, or how they're influencing scientists and what they're able to do with research software. This is a huge problem. It's much larger than research software, but it is particularly a problem in research software, because right now there are not agreed upon standards for most things. It's still coming together. And I think some real attention and time needs to be given. And part of our recommendation is we need to give that time and that attention at the field level to corral the information we can, and also identify what we need in order to have other information and start going after it. Strengthen the scaffolding. Again, I would look at this differently at a different time. And I think our research team would look at this a little differently at a different time. Scaffolding will get stronger. So this is a field that's in formation. I don't think it's just going to falter and fall apart. But that degree of attention that's given to how the pieces fit together is something that evolves very slowly, because it's constant negotiation. It's personalities in negotiation, not just organizations in negotiation. It's funding agencies in negotiation. And so in order to do that strengthening of the scaffolding, one of the things that I think is critical now in research software is to shift not all of the energy, but the dominant energy from create to integrate and maintain. So really moving from this focus on this new and spaces to explore, and let's bring up a new organization to be a society to help this cluster of people form a community. We may need to rethink how we're making investments in such things. And in particular, I'm going to encourage, and the team is encouraging, funders have got to think about this differently. I'm not naive. I know each of the funders, whether it's the philanthropics or whether it's the governments, they have their own bureaucratic systems that they too are locked in. They don't have, it's not like the program officer that's giving the grant has all the power. There are all kinds of things that prevent us from working together to make joint decisions and to really try to move together as a field. We can do better. Strengthening the scaffolding is going to require some different activity from the funders, not just from those who are receiving the funds. Some of that comes into this grow the market. And I think it's one of the most important observations that we're making. It's something that we heard pieces of in lots of interviews and that we definitely saw across the board in our desk research. This field, like so many other fields, is building itself, or the pieces of it are building as though they don't need to worry about how they're going to survive. They may think about sustainability, but most are thinking about it in very short-term ways, and they are leaning on the same funding sources, and those funding sources are not going to last. So, Sloan, CZI, NASA TOPS, we've got some very generous and helpful funders that have gotten things off the ground. They will not support this forever. And we've seen this in other fields as well. Again, this is not unique here. But figuring out how to identify not just the users, but how those users connect to our customers or your customers in the research software space is one of the real challenges ahead. And I think some concentrated studies from some of the growing pieces that are the scaffolding that will be the infrastructure to look not just at, can we attract more users, or we have so many users, this is wonderful, but instead, okay, how does that user connect to the dollars that are necessary to keep us running? This is not about profit. This is about keeping things running and having a system that's dependable. If we don't have a system that's dependable, if we don't have a marketplace where players are interacting in ways that are predictable, then the work won't happen. The research software work won't happen. So it really is necessary that this field gel and that we identify how the market works. The one other thing that I'll say about that is that procurement is a big piece of this. So right now, research software and a lot of the services that serve it, whether it's the societies, whether it's the actual tools, the packaging, all of the different pieces that are really, some of them are very robust, very, very solid product offerings. Who do you sell it to? The library's not a taker. It falls right between the gaps. Not really the library, not really the IT. So if you're in an academic or a research lab kind of organization, it doesn't have a clear procurement channel. We got to change that. So the last piece here is invest in coordination. Can't change that alone. It's not one market player that is going to figure out that, oh, here's where we go for procurement, and then it's solved for that one player and not for anyone else. It's not going to happen that way. This is going to be an advocacy-based process, and advocacy-based processes require coordination. As I mentioned earlier, coordination requires funding behind the coordination. Otherwise, you're in the same situation that Jennifer was describing in the volunteerism. People can't come to the table if they're not getting paid for that time, if they're not in secure positions. So you are cutting out huge swaths of the folks who need to be in the room in order to make sure that this is an equitable environment. So these are just a few pieces and touchstones that we have within the recommendations. There are lots of details in the report when it comes out. And, again, we'll be really interested to hear from folks what they think is feasible and where they want to focus. And I think one of the most important things for this field, for this emerging field, is to come together and determine what is a shared vision for some of those key players, some of those key scaffolding pieces that are starting to really build up. And how do you aim for it together so that it's not something that everybody is working kind of sort of towards, but don't really know, it's a platitude. This is our vision, is a platitude. No, like something concrete that you can actually map your work to and say, here's how I'm supporting that goal. And then funders need to be behind that kind of a shared agenda that develops within the field. But it has to develop from the community, not outside. Next slide. Move to wrap up in discussion. Handing it back to you, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. So yes, as we move toward wrap up and discussion, we've got just a couple more slides for you. I want to touch for just a minute on some of the very weighty questions that all of this raises. Catherine mentioned that it was a short project, and it did, as these questions come up in lots of different environments and contexts, this project raised a number of questions that would be really good to dig into in some more detail. A lot of these are things that we heard in our interviews and feel kind of especially relevant for research software. So Catherine mentioned the issue of procurement. The role of institutions is not something we had a lot of time to explore, but if research software is a first-class research object, then that's something that institutions should want to acknowledge as outputs of their faculty, right? What are the roles that they can play in supporting the work and also benefiting from it, is just one example. I mentioned earlier the human infrastructure. Really, everybody that we talked to in interviews was very interested in how to support the individuals that work in the space. That is something that cuts across infrastructures and really everywhere that people work. But it is a question that's worth exploring further, particularly in an emergent landscape. Some of this is about balance. So one of the things that we talked about in interviews was the idea of overlap and where is that reinforcement? Where do you have multiple organizations that need to be working on the same thing? And where does that sort of tip over into overcrowding? And similarly, the long tail is something that I think we heard in almost every single interview. How do you balance the needs of many projects and resources against those that might be larger, fewer, but serve larger communities? And how do you surface it? What's the recognition and reward, and how do you support it? And then finally, there's this idea of accidental infrastructure. Not every organization or initiative that becomes infrastructure set out to do that, and who recognizes that and helps guide those services towards becoming resilient infrastructure. So just a couple of more weighty topics to think about as we move towards discussion and wrap up. We're going to turn things over to Caitlin, and then we've got a few questions for you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Just a quick note, and also many of you have heard about this separately, but also through the work here. IOI also has been building out a discovery tool for infrastructures, for open infrastructures, called InfraFinder. We just hit past our 100 infrastructure mark on this. And I note this because this research project, outside of the incredible results and the findings that the team just walked you through, is also really important as we start to expand the representation of additional types of infrastructures that the research community relies on, so that we can understand and get more a deeper look at the sort of nuance and the application of some of these principles, so that we can work to steadily increase in a thoughtful manner the representation of these infrastructures. So again, a means of gradually building that out. But we encourage you all to check out InfraFinder. We have a number of the infrastructures that we spoke to as part of this process that are featured there, and others that are in consideration. And I'll hand it back to the team.
Okay, thank you. We can go to the next slide. So before we open it up for Q&A, we've got a few questions for you. We're going to do a few Zoom polls about what it means to define success. What does it mean if research software is accepted as a first-class research object? So the first poll, you should see it open on your screen now, is this is something that we've heard in a lot of interviews: is research software close to being accepted as a first-class research object? So we'll let each of these run for a little bit and share the results at the end. Our second question, and you can move through them as at your own pace, should the landscape have more or fewer organizations, initiatives, conferences, etc.? And then the final question, and there's a number of different options for this, so you should be able to select all that apply. What are the indicators of success? How do we know? How do you know if this is succeeding? And there's an other option in there. So these are anonymous polls, but if you care to share, please put your thoughts in the chat or in the shared document. It would be great to have some more details, particularly if you select other. So we'll let this go for a minute or so and share the results as everybody wraps up. So I see a question in the chat about how to interpret this. I love that question. That's a question that came up a lot, and it is really useful to see how people interpret these. So, you know, it might mean that there is, you know, consolidations or mergers for one example. So you know, do you think that when research software succeeds in attaining this status, that that might mean that maybe the tent gets bigger with more people in it? Maybe there are more tents with fewer people in it. It just depends on how you see it.
Jennifer, I just realized that sorry about that. I do realize what the confusion is. It's, I guess it's not a yes, no question. It's more or fewer. So maybe more is yes is more, no is fewer. Sorry about that. We should have updated the answer to be more clear.
I'm sorry about that. My connection dropped for just a second. So should the ecosystem have more or fewer organizations, initiatives, conferences, etc.? I mean, you can certainly interpret it more generally, but yeah, like Caitlin said, yes is more, no is fewer. That's the idea that question was trying to get at. What does the landscape look like? Does it mean, you know, more organizations that are more niche, for example, or, you know, what kind of shape does it take for you?
And thanks for bearing with us. We recognize that that poll was not set up right.
So it looks like some of the answers are still trickling in. Give it another few seconds, I guess, and then we can end the poll and share the results.
Everyone ready? Okay, 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right. I'm ending this and sharing it so y'all can see.
Super interesting. Thank you so much for bearing with the one poll in particular and for sharing your thoughts here. Yes, lots of uncertainty. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being game for that. So we can open this up to any questions, comments, and discussion for anyone on the team or each other.
I'm going to stop sharing, and I see we've got Zoe's hand up.
Hi, and I'm now more functional, having an early morning here in Vancouver. Really, really awesome to see this work progressing, and I'm super looking forward to reading the full report. I understand that it was small in scope, but I'm curious whether through these conversations or in your kind of bigger thinking about how this moves forward, are there other fields that you are looking to that are perhaps more at the maturity end of the spectrum that you think that there are things to learn from? I mean, I often think that in terms of like community development and advocacy, that the scholarly space is a little too insular at times. I think there's a lot out there we can learn from. So I'm curious if that came up, or if, as I say, you've kind of looking ahead to learning from other spaces like that. Thanks.
Well, I'll give a quick answer, and then I'll let any of my colleagues also answer. Yeah, it absolutely applies. Some of the things that we're studying look different in different fields across the landscape of scholarship and research circulation, and there are definitely differences between the ways that those are growing and developing. Research data, for example, we've done a little bit of work in that space, and that's certainly one that is, and people that we spoke with in research software cited it as something that is several steps ahead right now in terms of the formation process. I would also say some of the work that IOI has done on specific types of infrastructures like preprints it sheds some light on how formation is working across different fields and how some of these players cross different fields. So we're definitely looking at that, and you know, we won't take a broader view than we can handle at any one time. So this study is very much about research software, but there are some more general things that we are learning along the way that we will also be sharing. Thanks, Zoe. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I found Melissa's hand. Got Melissa.
Hi, so this is a comment on one of the options that was presented for what kind of our markers of success might be in terms of reducing reliance on grant funding, which I thought was interesting because our current first class research, often isn't, we kind of expect that new research is going to continue to be grant funded, right? So I guess I'm curious to know if do you take it as a settled question that research software needs to expect to be grant funded only for an initial phase, or is that an area where you're looking at advocacy with various funders to try to change that expectation?
I think Catherine's looking at me to take that one. I think that, so, we study a lot of this in depth in terms of the nuance, right? And so I think that there's a couple different things to extricate. So we're big fans of diversifying some of the funding and resourcing. And I'll say explicitly that some of the reliance on two major funders in this space that are primed to and very likely will be shifting their portfolio is going to leave a lot of the essential open source software in a very quick lurch, right? And I think if anyone's not planning on that, then you should be. And we're happy to talk just because of, the fact that there's a certain predictability to, how much of a specific grant funding portfolio, that usual 3 to 5 year sweet spot, but also just in terms of the broader maintenance. And this is where we've been working with a number of infrastructures and this is thinking more of like the organizations as well as those that are developing, recognizing there's larger examples where something may be a core piece of research software infrastructure heavily funded by, say, government or by other organizations that starting to think about what that long-term looks like and what a resilience plan might be, we would advise. So in some cases, that may be that there are service models. I see, James Monroe's on the call. 2I2C is a great example of that, right? There are opportunities to start to ensure that if you do have funding from major philanthropic or government initiatives, that your relationship may change with those groups, but that you're also exploring. And this also can be a very nice way to tie to that demand, where there are different revenue models that may help augment that. And it may be different structured support, different tailored service in various areas, different means of offsetting specific costs. It may be around collaborations and shared staff. It may be around so there's lots and lots of different options. And I think our stance at IOI is that we need to be much more creative than just thinking of the sort of soft money or grant-based money and a membership-based model, because we're seeing way too many organizations fall in the middle of that, right? And it's not just about, which I feel like 10 years ago, it was like, well, we're just going to be a freemium model. That also is not, a magic bullet. So recognizing that for each community and for each instance, there's a certain investment of time that, we've been trying to see where we can help support, but other organizations also are trying to assist in this, where you can dig a little bit deeper into what makes most sense in a values or a community aligned way that also may be able to start sketching out that plan to move towards experimenting or testing other models. Sustainability takes a long time to be able to get to. It's very rare that you can get there overnight. But I think we're accustomed to in previous years of there being maybe one or two legs of the funding stool that are wobbly at any given time. Right now, we're facing a lot of volatility across major pots of relied upon resourcing that's making it very, very difficult to predict or to have funding get picked up by other pieces of, whether it's, government, institutions, research funders, research councils, et cetera. Many of those are undergoing systemic changes all at the same time, and there's knock-on effects. So it's kind of a non-answer to your question, but I think getting into some of those specifics, we're happy to take it offline too, to think through. I hope that helps. No.
I wonder if you've sort of learned anything at all about what organizations need in terms of capacities to sort of start building these models. There's just like the example that I'm thinking of sort of off the bat is that one challenge with a lot of open source software is a lot less information about users than other places have, right? Like there's both just like strong technical and just like community norms often that are barriers to like collecting user data, right? That like more commercial approaches don't have a problem with, right? So you have it can be very difficult to like understand your market and your potential users and the people who have incentives to support you. And so figuring out how you could get that information is one thing, but that's just one potential piece of the toolkit of like, that's what I might need to start, figuring out models of support. Is that something that, if you found other things on that front, and I don't know if that's going to fit into this report?
We have. I might hand that to Catherine to take that one.
Or to Jennifer, actually. Do you want to take that one, Jennifer?
I'll take a piece of it. It's a great question. I mean, that's one of the categories of missing information that we're trying to highlight, and that is a perfect example, but it's sort of one piece of what is the kind of quote unquote product information that you need to determine, what's the scope of your use, but also, things like, user experience and some of these other kind of more product management type roles. So, I mean, one of the things that we talked about, we didn't really get to in the presentation, was just what's the data that you need to make some of these decisions to lay out a strategic plan. And that is a great example, but it's just, one piece of many. Some of it's there and it's not collected, or it's, not standardized, or whatever the case may be. But that's one of the things the community can have a conversation about. What is it that we really want to know before we, map out our next stages, as organizations or as communities? Does that, I don't know, Catherine or Caitlin, if you had anything else on that.
I'll add just a little bit to that to say, and actually I'll tie it to a question that came up in the notes from Alan about areas of commonality across the different infrastructures. One of the things that that I think is hard, it's just a hard piece to get over by yourself, is that kind of question about use or about how you're tracking, et cetera. You can't, individual institutions can't do that. So even if a funder is funding, one group to do that research, that might help them find some of the things that they need. But so much of this is about the way that we agree as a group of practitioners to share information with each other. And so there are some specific recommendations that we make about how bringing together funding, and hopefully bringing together funding from multiple funders, to look at some of those common spaces that can't be addressed by a single institution is really important. And some of that is skilling up. So one of the things that we talk about in the report is the Mellon Foundation over the last couple of years did a really interesting cohort approach with the Nonprofit Finance Fund to help a whole bunch of infrastructures that needed a lift to get together the training that they needed in a cohort where they're reinforcing each other about how to manage financial backbones for their organizations or for their initiatives. Those kinds of cohort models and those kinds of bringing groups together do several things at once. They help to build the trust. They help to make sure that the conversation lines are open for some of the things that need to be happening. And they also help to address some of those big, hairy problems that are really too much for a single institution to solve.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I know people are having to drop off. I think we're at the top of the hour.
I have one from Alan in the notes. Were there areas of commonality across the different infrastructures that would benefit from shared or common pool of investments?
Right. And again, that's kind of, I tried to tie to that in the answer that I gave to the previous question. It's a lot of what we need to do right now comes down to common pool investments. So again, the idea of bringing together cohorts to attack some of these very, very thorny problems about market, or bringing together cohorts to deal with issues of measurement and bringing those together maybe even across other fields that are related, like research data. It is challenging right now to imagine this field being able to progress to the next level unless some of those joint activities are really given the funding in the space to take off. I'm again mindful that we are over time, so I want to thank everybody tremendously. Melissa, we would love your question in the document. I'm sorry to cut us off. But I do want to respect everybody's time. And again, just a huge thank you both for those that participated in the project itself. We look forward to feedback from all of you who took the time to be here with us today. And we just really appreciate the work that each of you are doing in this general space, but also in the broader research space. So thank you so much.